On December 21, 1944, in the frozen forests just south of Malmedy, Belgium, a German soldier huddled in his foxhole as American artillery thundered above him. For 3 years he'd endured the horrors of the Eastern Front. He'd witnessed entire divisions annihilated near Kursk. He'd survived bombardment after bombardment. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The shells weren't hitting the ground like they should. They were detonating high above his head, suspended 20 to 30 feet above the snow-covered earth, exploding with terrifying precision. The result was a lethal hail of shrapnel cascading down from above, turning his foxhole from a refuge into a coffin. He pressed himself flat against the frozen dirt, feeling superheated fragments whistle overhead, watching in horror as men around him were torn apart by steel that seemed to come from every direction at once. That very morning, before dawn broke, this soldier had examined an unexploded American shell. What he found inside defied everything he thought possible. The shell's nose fuse contained what looked like a complete radio transmitter, no larger than a wine bottle, packed densely with miniature glass vacuum tubes. These fragile, delicate components had somehow endured being fired from a cannon at forces that should have pulverized them to dust. German engineers had spent 10 years concluding such a device was theoretically impossible. Yet the Americans hadn't just built it. They were manufacturing them by the tens of thousands. This single discovery would reshape Germany's entire understanding of American industrial capacity and, by extension, what Germany was truly up against. The real story began not in the Belgian snow, but thousands of miles away in American laboratories and factories. It started in the summer of 1940, when American scientists faced what every major military power had deemed an unsolvable problem. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, assembled the nation's finest physicists and engineers under Van der Busch's leadership. Among them stood Merle Tuve, a brilliant but temperamental physicist whose volatile genius would eventually drive a team of over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The challenge they faced was deceptively simple to describe, yet seemingly impossible to accomplish. German and Japanese aircraft were decimating Allied vessels and ground forces. Anti-aircraft guns of the conventional type required either a direct hit, extraordinarily difficult against a target maneuvering at 300 miles per hour, or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined height. The reality was brutally clear. Early in the war, it took roughly 20,000 shells to shoot down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates suggested it took 100,000 rounds. The idea of a proximity fuse had been discussed for decades, but making it work was another story entirely. The concept sounded straightforward. Build a fuse that could sense an approaching target and detonate automatically. In theory, elegant. In practice, the technology of the 1930s made it seem utterly impossible. Germany had explored the idea starting in 1930, creating over 30 different designs, including acoustic sensors that would trigger on-engine noise and electrostatic detectors sensitive to charged aircraft surfaces. By 1939, German researchers had concluded the technical barriers were insurmountable. When Hitler issued directives in 1940, demanding projects that could enter production within 6 months to support the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the first casualties. Rheinmetall Borsig would attempt limited work again in 1944, but by then it was far too late to alter the war's outcome. Britain had pursued it further. By 1939, researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using a miniature Doppler radar system. They tested prototypes on rockets, which faced less extreme acceleration than artillery shells. Yet Britain's program hit 2 insurmountable barriers. The cost was staggering, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to its absolute limit. More critically, they couldn't solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still far too delicate to withstand the violent shock of being fired from a cannon. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps half the time under perfect conditions. For actual military use, this was worthless. When America entered the war, the British shared their research through the Tizard mission. But it would be American scientists and American industry that actually transformed it into reality. The Americans took the British work and accomplished what no other nation could. They built it. Not as a laboratory experiment, but as a mass-produced weapon manufactured by the millions. Section T, which would become the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, was established on March 10, 1942, beginning in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, engineers settled on a radio-based proximity fuse built on Doppler radar principles. A miniaturized transmitter in the shell's nose would broadcast radio waves at roughly 180 to 220 megahertz. When those waves bounced off a target and returned, the frequency would shift because of the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a specific frequency, indicating the target was in lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and trigger the detonator. The theory was beautiful. Making it actually work was torture. Think about what the engineers had to accomplish. The fuse needed to fit into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, with enough room remaining for 7 pounds of high explosive. Within that cramped space, they had to cram a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power supply, safety systems, and a detonator. Everything had to function in extreme cold and survive months of storage. Worst of all, it had to endure the violence of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell launches, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in approximately 20 feet of barrel. This creates acceleration forces equal to 20,000 times Earth's gravity. Every single component experiences a crushing blow equivalent to being struck by a sledgehammer. The shell spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it races through the rifled barrel. After surviving this brutality, the delicate electronics had to function flawlessly during the few seconds of flight before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as one of the founding members, took on the mission of creating what the team termed rugged vacuum tubes. He began with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These tubes were engineered for the gentle environment of a person's pocket, not the violence of artillery. Working alongside Sylvania engineers, Van Allen rebuilt the tubes completely from scratch. The glass housings were made thicker and carefully heat-treated. The internal filaments and grids were reconfigured with shorter spans and heavier construction. The tubes were embedded in wax inside the fuse body, which provided shock absorption. Every modification was tested by firing complete fuses straight down into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth provided a gentle enough landing that researchers could recover the fuses and inspect the tubes under microscopes, looking for breaks and failures. Through hundreds of test firings and countless design refinements, the team gradually developed tubes capable of surviving. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any advancement in anti-aircraft capabilities, accepted this failure rate and approved mass production tooling. The engineers were optimistic they could push reliability higher as production ramped up, and they proved right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed past 90%. But vacuum tubes represented only one obstacle. The fuse required a power source. Standard batteries were too bulky and deteriorated quickly, especially in tropical conditions. The engineers devised a reserve battery using a liquid electrolyte kept isolated from the battery plates until the moment of firing. When the shell launched, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This provided indefinite storage life. The fuse demanded multiple safety mechanisms. It couldn't activate until completely clear of the cannon. It needed safeguards against accidental detonation from radio signals or the ship's own radar equipment. It required wave suppression circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at shallow angles over water. Each safety feature added layers of complexity. When development finished, each proximity fuse contained roughly 130 miniaturized electronic parts. The Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun stretched 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing sat perhaps the most sophisticated miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were three radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using standard ammunition, destroying these maneuvering drones normally required dozens of shots. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all three drones with just 4 bursts on the opening day of testing. The Navy immediately stopped the remaining scheduled tests and ordered production to commence. 5 corporations were chosen to manufacture the fuses: Crossley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodiak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production began modestly. By the end of 1942, factories were churning out 500 fuses daily. But American industrial capacity was just beginning to ramp up. By late 1943, production had exploded to 40,000 fuses per day. Throughout the entire war, American industry manufactured over 22 million proximity fuses, costing more than $1 billion. More than 100 factories participated in some aspect of production. Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 505,913 fuses, representing 24% of the total output. The company hired 10,000 workers operating continuously, 7 days weekly, hitting peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts, produced even greater numbers, manufacturing 5,683,032 fuses while also producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used throughout the entire program. Tens of thousands of workers, including vast numbers of women, assembled the intricate parts under absolute secrecy conditions. Workers took secrecy oaths and underwent searches when entering and departing the factories. They had no idea what they were assembling. Security for the proximity fuses was rivaled only by the Manhattan Project itself. The device received the deliberately misleading designation VT fuses, supposedly standing for variable time, obscuring its true nature as a radio proximity detector. Its very existence remained classified. Even its use in combat faced initial restrictions to situations where captured duds couldn't fall into enemy hands. Combat deployment happened on January 5, 1943, near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese aircraft, 3 A-dive bombers, attacked a U.S. Navy task force. As the aircraft withdrew from their assault, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the 5-inch battery aboard the cruiser USS Helena, unleashed 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the escaping bombers. All 3 shells detonated near one aircraft, shredding it with steel fragments. The aircraft plummeted into the ocean. Helena's gunners had accomplished what would have taken dozens of conventional shells. They'd brought down an enemy plane without scoring a direct hit. The news of this success rippled through the Pacific Fleet rapidly. By mid-1943, large quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were reaching Pearl Harbor. Combat effectiveness surpassed every expectation. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire received credit for over half of all Japanese aircraft, downed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses making up only 25% of all shells fired. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who later became Chief of Naval Operations, remembered that during his time as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding the fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses were knocking down enemy planes by the dozens. The weapon's true power emerged during a kamikaze attack on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa. 2 destroyers, USS Hadley and USS Evans, endured assault from approximately 150 Japanese aircraft during Operation Kikusue No. 6, many packed with explosives and committed to suicide runs. For roughly 1 hour and 25 minutes of merciless combat, the 2 destroyers and 4 escort vessels faced overwhelming numbers. Hadley shot down 23 enemy planes before taking 1 bomb, 3 kamikaze hits, and 1 Oka rocket bomb. Evans accounted for additional aircraft before suffering 4 suicide plane impacts and being left disabled. Both vessels survived despite severe damage. The proximity-fused ammunition proved absolutely indispensable. For most of the war, though, the Pentagon refused to authorize use over land. The danger was too great that an unexploded shell would be captured by the enemy. If German or Japanese engineers could reverse engineer the technology or devise countermeasures, the consequences would be catastrophic. If Germany equipped its anti-aircraft batteries with proximity fuses, military intelligence estimated, bomber losses could jump by 300%. The proximity fuse remained locked away during the early war years, too precious to risk. The strategic bombing campaign depended entirely on keeping this technology secret. Shells with these fuses were only tested over open water, where any dud would disappear into the depths where German hands could never retrieve it. But in July 1943, when one of these shells actually fell on Sicily during the invasion, panic rippled through headquarters. A special team was immediately dispatched to find it before the Germans could. The security lockdown was absolute. Nothing could compromise this advantage. Then came June 1944, and everything changed. Germany unleashed something new across the English Channel, the V-1 flying bomb. These pilotless missiles screamed toward London at 400 miles per hour, faster than many of the fighters trying to intercept them. Small, swift, arriving without any warning, they presented a nightmare for Britain's air defences. By late August, Germany had hurled more than 9,000 of these weapons across the water. The casualties mounted horrifically. Tens of thousands of British civilians were killed and wounded. At first, the anti-aircraft guns could only destroy about 17% of the incoming V-1s. The situation had become desperate. Britain was being pummeled, and conventional defences were failing. Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced an agonizing choice. The security protocols that had protected the proximity fuse for years now stood directly opposed to military necessity. He authorized its use in the anti-aircraft guns defending Britain. Modified fuses, specially calibrated for these small, speedy targets, rushed into production. British and American gun crews along the coast received the new ammunition. Radar systems and fire control computers worked in perfect coordination with the proximity-fused shells. The transformation was extraordinary. Within 4 weeks, the destruction rate climbed to 74%. By late August, on certain days, 82% of the incoming missiles were being shot down before they reached British soil. The breakthrough was so stunning that Churchill would later declare the proximity fuse had made these successes possible. The secret had been preserved through most of the war, but now thousands of these fuses were being fired over land. The risk that seemed unacceptable in 1943 had to be weighed against immediate survival. That calculation shifted entirely on December 16, 1944. The morning erupted with chaos as over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks crashed through the Ardennes forest in Operation Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's final gamble to split the Allies and capture Antwerp. The assault caught everyone off guard. Within days, German armor had driven a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. Snow fell heavily. Clouds blanketed the sky so completely that Allied aircraft could not fly. German commanders felt confident that poor visibility meant their forces would be safe from artillery observation. They were catastrophically wrong. Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group. That same December morning, German forces were attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Montschau. The cavalry, lightly equipped and desperate, pleaded for artillery support. Axelson had just received a shipment of new ammunition, proximity-fused shells codenamed POSIT. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had not yet authorized their use over land. The security restrictions remained technically in place. Axelson made his decision. The military emergency overrode the security protocols. He ordered his gunners to fire the proximity-fused shells. What happened next changed everything. For the first time in the European theater, American artillery was delivering air bursts with perfect consistency. No terrain could fool them. No poor visibility could degrade their performance. Each shell detonated between 20 and 50 feet above the ground, precisely calibrated to devastate everything below. The fragments spread outward in a cone pattern far larger than anything a ground burst could achieve. Foxholes offered no shelter. Bunkers reinforced with logs could not stop shrapnel raining down from above. German soldiers who had survived years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front had never encountered anything resembling this. The shells approached at velocities so extreme that sound arrived too late to warn anyone. The first indication of danger was the explosion directly overhead. By December 19th, 3 days into the offensive, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to deploy the proximity fuses without restrictions. 2 days later, on December 21st, all security limitations were removed. Over the following 6 weeks, 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired across the European theatre. The effect on German forces was immediate and overwhelming. General George Patton wrote a report describing an engagement near the Sauer River. His Third Army had trapped a German battalion attempting to cross a river and had unleashed a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused shells. By actual body count, between 700 and 800 enemy soldiers were killed. Patton described the new shell with the funny fuse as devastating. He predicted that once all armies possessed this weapon, military warfare itself would have to be completely reinvented. That same December morning, SS Colonel Otto Scorsoni's Panzer Brigade 150 attacked the town of Malmedy around 4:30 in the morning as part of an elaborate German deception operation. American artillery battalions defending the position responded with proximity-fused shells. The air bursts were so terrifying that some German troops abandoned tactical discipline and charged directly toward American positions, seeking any refuge from the explosions overhead. By afternoon, the attack had been repelled. German prisoners interrogated afterward described the psychological devastation. One German artillery officer, captured in January 1945, explained what he had witnessed. American engineering, he said, solved problems that should have been impossible through the massive application of resources. The proximity fuse required extraordinary manufacturing infrastructure and willingness to spend enormous sums of money. Germany could never have produced it, not because German engineers lacked skill, but because German industry simply could not support the required infrastructure. A Luftwaffe engineer added his own analysis. If Germany had possessed proximity fuses, he estimated that Allied strategic bombing would have become unsustainable. With loss rates of 15 to 20 aircraft per mission, the entire bombing campaign would have collapsed. Yet he immediately acknowledged that Germany could never have developed this technology. It required an economy capable of allocating billions to a single weapon and mobilizing over 100 factories. Only America possessed that capacity. German soldiers experienced a more brutal understanding. They were being killed by technology they could not comprehend, produced in quantities they could never match. American tactical doctrine had evolved specifically to maximize the fuse's lethality. Forward observers called down fire on suspected positions, not just visible targets. Artillery batteries laid down barrage patterns that covered entire areas. Every shell became an effective air burst. German defensive tactics, refined through years of warfare, became useless overnight. Traditional fortified positions turned into death traps. Moving in the open during artillery fire meant certain death. German commanders tried adapting by spreading units wider and keeping them constantly mobile. But there were limits to what dispersal could achieve. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the equation. German soldiers began showing signs of what American intelligence termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the overwhelming helplessness of facing proximity-fused fire. Some units developed discipline problems as soldiers refused orders to move into areas under American artillery coverage. German commanders grew so desperate that they offered rewards for intact proximity fuses, hoping examination might reveal how to jam them or find other countermeasures. By January 1945, Wright Field in Ohio had already developed electronic countermeasure systems designed to jam the fuse's radio signals, anticipating that captured fuses would lead to German jamming attempts. But German engineers never understood what they had captured. They had concluded that radio-based proximity fuses were physically impossible given the acceleration forces involved in artillery fire. The concept of miniature radio transmitters housed inside shells never occurred to them. As the war continued from January through March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots reported shells that detonated whenever they approached, regardless of altitude or evasive maneuvers. What had once been dangerous but survivable anti-aircraft fire became an almost impenetrable barrier. On the ground, the destruction intensified. During Rhine crossing operations, American artillery unleashed tens of thousands of proximity-fused shells, creating such overwhelming devastation that German defenders could not mount effective resistance. In cities, the shells were especially lethal. Set to detonate at rooftop level, they converted entire city blocks into clouds of shrapnel, making defensive positions completely untenable. General Eisenhower, reflecting after the war ended, spoke about the proximity fuse in starkly consequential terms. He suggested that had Germany succeeded in perfecting and deploying proximity fuses 6 months before the Allies, the invasion of Europe would have been extraordinarily difficult, possibly impossible. The counterfactual was sobering. German anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuses might have rendered D-Day unsustainable. German artillery armed with proximity fuses during the Normandy campaign could have inflicted casualties severe enough to stop the entire invasion. The technical documents captured after the war revealed that Germany had explored the problem extensively. German forces had developed more than 30 different approaches to the proximity fuse, some remarkably sophisticated. The Kranich acoustic fuse employed a mechanical tone filter connected to a resonating reed switch. Rheinmetall developed an electrostatic fuse using capacitive detection. There were optical fuses, magnetic fuses, and experimental radio fuses similar to American designs, but nothing advanced beyond limited testing. When research accelerated at Rheinmetall in 1944, hundreds of working prototypes were developed and tested. By then, however, it was far too late. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to establish mass production. Even if facilities could have been built, the resources would have competed with tank production, aircraft manufacturing, and basic ammunition. The American program succeeded because it commanded resources that exceeded Germany's entire military research budget. The proximity fuse program alone consumed over $1 billion in 1945 currency. This included not just research and development, but constructing dedicated production facilities, training tens of thousands of workers, and maintaining absolute security around every aspect of the program. The production figures were staggering. At peak capacity, American factories produced 70,000 fuses daily. That meant nearly 3 billion individual components manufactured to exact specifications, assembled, tested, and distributed to combat zones worldwide. Mass production dramatically reduced costs. In 1942, each fuse cost $732. By 1945, manufacturing innovations and economies of scale had slashed that to just $18 per fuse. That represented a 97.5% reduction, resulting from continuous improvement in production techniques and efficiency. At $18, the fuse was expensive, but not prohibitively so. The increased lethality justified the cost. A proximity-fused shell delivered the equivalent effect of 5 to 10 conventional shells. Since the shell cost the same regardless of fuse type, paying extra for a fuse that multiplied effectiveness was obviously worthwhile. The secrecy surrounding the program was so absolute that workers at different factories did not know other facilities were building identical components. Suppliers manufactured parts without understanding their purpose or how they functioned. The security classification remained in effect until September 1945, when the war concluded and the proximity fuse was finally revealed publicly. For German prisoners of war who had been held in Britain and witnessed the defense against V-1 flying bombs, the public revelation was profound. They had seen anti-aircraft guns firing and missiles detonating in mid-air, but only later understood that the same technology had devastated their forces in the Ardennes and was now protecting British cities. The psychological impact mirrored what German prisoners held in America experienced witnessing American industrial production firsthand. It was a crushing realization that they had been fighting an adversary whose resources were so vast, so overwhelming, that German efforts could never possibly compete. The interviews conducted with German soldiers in 1946 after they returned home revealed something profound about how they understood the war's outcome. One former Wehrmacht officer spoke about the proximity fuse with particular intensity. It wasn't the weapon itself that finally convinced him Germany had lost, he explained. Rather, it was what that weapon represented about American capabilities and industrial reach. The proximity fuse solved a problem Germany had deemed beyond solution. Creating it demanded industrial muscle, scientific knowledge, and economic resources Germany simply couldn't muster. If the Americans could pack miniaturized radios into artillery shells and have them function after enduring forces that would obliterate ordinary electronics, what couldn't they build? The officers' realization crystallized into this: Germany was fighting a modern war while operating under outdated assumptions about technological possibility. The proximity fuse embodied multiple layers of innovation. Those miniaturized vacuum tubes represented breakthroughs in materials science, entirely new approaches to glass composition and how that glass was treated and cooled to prevent defects. The printed circuit boards themselves ranked among the first examples of mass-produced circuit boards, a technology that would eventually transform the entire electronics world. The reserve battery system, activated by centrifugal force when the shell spun through the air, showed genuine creativity. The radio components demonstrated elegant design and efficient operation, but perhaps most remarkably, the real breakthrough lay in how these devices were made and how quality was maintained. Manufacturing millions of intricate electronic devices with reliable consistency demanded production systems and processes that barely existed in any form before the war. American factories developed statistical methods for controlling quality, created automated systems for testing components, and built supply chains with precision previously unknown in manufacturing. The programs for training workers proved equally important. Tens of thousands of people, many with no technical background whatsoever, learned to assemble delicate electronic components under microscopes with painstaking accuracy. James Van Allen, a physicist instrumental in developing the rugged vacuum tubes that could survive proximity fuse duties, later transferred that same miniaturization knowledge to creating scientific instruments for space exploration. The first American satellite, launched in 1958, carried instruments that drew their technical ancestry directly from proximity fuse development. The radiation belts that carry Van Allen's name were discovered using equipment that wouldn't have existed without what engineers learned building proximity fuses. The technical knowledge gained from making electronics withstand the brutal forces of artillery fire translated directly into making electronics tough enough for rocket launches beyond Earth's atmosphere. But the knowledge transfer didn't stop there. Engineers who spent years perfecting proximity fuses moved into positions throughout the electronics industry, bringing deep expertise in miniaturization, quality control, and mass production techniques that had been proven in wartime. The proximity fuse's military influence extended well beyond the Second World War. During the Korean conflict, American forces deployed improved versions of the same fundamental design. Contemporary weapon systems still use proximity fuses, descended from that original 1942 concept. The Phoenix missile, the Standard Missile family, and the Patriot air defense system all incorporate proximity fuses based on those same underlying principles. Modern versions use solid-state electronics, microprocessors, and advanced signal processing capabilities, allowing them to distinguish between actual targets and false signals while operating in heavily jammed environments. Yet the core concept hasn't changed. The fuses still detect targets using reflected radio signals, calculate the ideal moment to detonate, and trigger the warhead for maximum destructive effect. Throughout the war years, German soldiers encountered something that shook their fundamental beliefs more profoundly than any material shortage. Despite the propaganda describing Americans as soft and sentimental, German prisoners discovered that American military forces combined absolute toughness with unexpected compassion toward defeated enemies. Medical care had the deepest impact. German doctors worked alongside American medical personnel, absorbing new treatment methods and utilizing equipment that represented technological achievements only available to Germany's highest-ranking officers. Prisoners received surgical procedures that in Germany would have been reserved exclusively for the nation's elite. Mental health treatment, virtually non-existent in the Wehrmacht, was offered to soldiers suffering from psychological trauma. American officials responded to attempted suicides with counseling and care, not punishment and imprisonment. Soldiers experiencing mental collapse received therapy and support, not brutality and abandonment. This demonstrated humanity toward adversaries communicated something crucial. Genuine strength produces confidence that permits generosity. By March 1945, educational initiatives had enrolled thousands of German prisoners in courses covering English language, American history, and democratic governance. The University of Chicago provided correspondence instruction that reached into camps across America. Prisoners who arrived as committed believers in Nazi ideology found themselves writing papers, analyzing democratic systems and reconstruction. Officers who had sworn sacred oaths to Hitler began developing plans for introducing American agricultural practices into a future German economy. The shift proved so dramatic that American officials grew concerned prisoners were becoming overly enthusiastic about American society. Certain prisoners petitioned to remain in America after repatriation became possible. From 1945 through 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners were sent back to a Germany that was fragmented, devastated, and impoverished. Yet they carried something invaluable back with them: understanding of how a democratic industrial nation actually functioned. Many of these returning prisoners became influential figures in West Germany's rebuilding efforts. They brought American industrial methods to German factories and American democratic principles into German civic life. The larger historical lesson transcended the proximity fuse itself, extending to encompass American industrial power throughout the entire war. America didn't simply overwhelm the Axis militarily through sheer quantity. American weapons weren't invariably superior individually, but they functioned with remarkable reliability, appeared in staggering numbers, and incorporated technological breakthroughs like proximity fuses that delivered decisive military advantages. That pairing of quantity with quality formed the basis of American military dominance. The proximity fuse functioned as a force multiplier, converting numerical superiority into overwhelming tactical and strategic advantage. During the final year of conflict, German forces increasingly faced adversaries equipped with superior weapons, vastly greater weapon quantities, and technological innovations that rendered conventional battlefield tactics obsolete. The casualty figures told the story clearly. During the Battle of the Bulge, although German forces achieved initial surprise and benefited from favorable geography, they suffered disproportionate losses. American artillery accounted for an unusually large share of German casualties in this and subsequent operations. Medical teams documented that wounds inflicted by proximity-fused shells tended toward greater severity than wounds from conventional artillery rounds. Because the fuses detonated overhead, the shrapnel came downward, concentrating damage on heads and shoulders. Soldiers frequently sustained multiple fragment wounds rather than single injury patterns. The increased lethality was unmistakable. By March 1945, as the Allied advance prepared to cross the Rhine and push into German territory, proximity-fused ammunition had become standard issue for every American artillery unit. Manufacturing facilities were producing fuses faster than logistics could move them across the Atlantic. Germany never created practical solutions to counter proximity fuses. Electronic interference was theoretically feasible, but would have required detailed knowledge of the fuse's operating frequency and specific technical characteristics. Without capturing intact, functional fuses for detailed analysis, German engineers couldn't determine the technical specifications necessary for effective jamming attempts. Even with that information, deploying jamming equipment across all potential target areas would have exceeded German capabilities. Physical countermeasures proved equally futile. Because fuses operated by detecting reflected radio waves, reducing the radar reflectivity of troops and equipment proved impossible. The human body itself reflected sufficient radio energy to trigger detonation at moderate distances. The only viable defense involved spreading out widely enough that one shell wouldn't affect multiple soldiers. But this dispersion degraded combat effectiveness and complicated coordinated tactical operations. German military doctrine had been built around concentrated unit formations that generated maximum firepower. Spreading out to counter proximity fuses necessarily weakened overall combat capability, even as it reduced casualties from individual shell bursts. As the war's final months unfolded, certain German units approached paralysis from fear of American artillery assault. Formations refused to move through daylight hours. They avoided any location that might represent an attractive target. Morale deteriorated steadily. Pervasive helplessness eroded the motivation to continue fighting. American intelligence documented that German prisoners increasingly identified proximity-fused artillery as the decisive factor driving surrender decisions. The fear wasn't simply fear of dying. Soldiers had generally accepted death as a possibility, but specifically the fear of proximity-fused artillery's devastating accuracy, which left no possibility of survival and provided no means of effective defense. This represented psychological warfare of extraordinary effectiveness. But psychological warfare achieved not through propaganda and deception, but through the demonstrated futility of any meaningful resistance. Military historians conducting post-war analysis concluded that proximity fuses constituted one of the principal technological advantages that shortened the war's duration. Expert estimates suggest the fuses conserved tens of thousands of Allied lives by accelerating campaign timelines and strengthening defensive operations effectiveness. Against Japanese shipping in the Pacific Theater, proximity fuses prevented losses that would have substantially delayed amphibious and naval operations. This strategic significance multiplied dramatically because fuses were manufactured in essentially unlimited quantities beginning in late 1944, eliminating any requirement for conservation or careful rationing. Artillery missions that would have appeared wasteful or unjustifiable using conventional ammunition became routine procedure. Suspected enemy positions could be subjected to concentrated fire. Defensive artillery plans could blanket expansive territories with overlapping protective fire zones. The psychological dimension of unlimited ammunition availability mattered as profoundly as the physical destruction it created. Beyond its military applications, the proximity fuse's technological heritage influenced the entire electronics sector. The miniaturization approaches shaped how the electronics industry evolved. The quality control practices became foundational manufacturing standards. The worker training initiatives demonstrated that intricate technical manufacturing could be accomplished by ordinary people without advanced technical education, provided they received thorough training and proper supervision. These principles transformed post-war American industry fundamentally. The emerging space program, computer development, and the transistor revolution all built upon knowledge and methodologies established during proximity fuse research and production. The scientists and engineers involved in proximity fuse work achieved remarkable professional accomplishments. James Van Allen emerged as a pioneering force in space science itself. Merle Tuve continued directing sophisticated scientific work at the Carnegie Institution. Many others established themselves in universities, corporate research departments, and governmental research organizations, contributing knowledge in miniaturization, electronics, and integrated systems design. This intellectual capacity that emerged from proximity fuse development undergirded American technological and electronics leadership throughout the following 50 years. The manufacturing capacity constructed to produce proximity fuses discovered fresh applications following the war's conclusion. Facilities that manufactured vacuum tubes for fuses converted to producing television tubes and household electronics. Workers trained in precision assembly techniques formed the skilled workforce foundation for the rapidly expanding electronics industry. Distribution networks originally built for fuse components supported the rapid growth of consumer electronics businesses. At its core, the proximity fuse narrative illustrates how resources, choices, and divergent technological philosophies shaped different nations' wartime strategies. Germany channeled resources into advanced weapons, like jet fighters and long-range missiles. These represented genuine technological achievements, but emerged too late and in quantities far too limited to meaningfully alter the war's direction. America concentrated on technologies capable of immediate mass manufacture. Proximity fuses, despite their sophistication, were engineered from inception with manufacturability and dependability as central design principles. Every development decision prioritized how readily these devices could be mass manufactured and how reliably they would perform. The outcome was a weapon obtainable in overwhelming quantities, precisely when needed most. This philosophy reflected fundamentally different strategic outlooks. Germany pursued technological superweapons imagined to overcome Allied numerical disadvantages. America pursued competent, effective weapons, producible in quantities transforming Allied numerical advantages into complete dominance. The proximity fuse wasn't a superweapon. It represented a genuinely excellent weapon manufactured in genuinely vast quantities. That strategic approach determined the war's outcome decisively. In final assessment, the proximity fuse embodied everything characterizing American industrial dominance during World War II. It married sophisticated technology with practical manufacturing realities. It demanded substantial financial investment but delivered proportional effectiveness in return. It achieved sophistication without sacrificing manufacturability. It proved effective while remaining economically viable at massive scale. It demonstrated innovation while maintaining absolute dependability. The fuse exemplified how America engaged and ultimately triumphed in the Second World War. By surmounting seemingly insurmountable technical obstacles through deployment of extraordinary resources, exceptional engineering talent, and an industrial infrastructure capable of generating technological achievements in the millions. German soldiers confronting proximity-fused artillery fire grasped this reality intuitively. Wehrmacht veterans discussing their experiences with post-war interviewers consistently depicted the fuse not merely as an effective weapon, but as physical evidence of America's comprehensive technological, industrial, and national superiority. Proximity fuses concluded Germany's war not through single catastrophic defeats, but through the accumulating evidence of countless engagements, each reinforcing the identical message. They faced adversaries possessing capabilities Germany could neither match nor adequately counter. That understanding, ultimately more decisive than any single lost battle, shattered the Wehrmacht's resolve and hastened the Third Reich's collapse. The weapon deemed impossible to construct became the weapon that revolutionized warfare itself. American scientists, engineers, factory workers, and military commanders had achieved what international experts had declared beyond reach. They had created miniaturized electronic systems, manufactured delicate vacuum tubes that could endure artillery forces, and produced the complete assemblies by the tens of millions. The proximity fuse stands as evidence of what open societies accomplish when they marshal scientific brilliance alongside industrial might and unyielding resolve. It validated that humanity's greatest achievements emerge not from pursuing impossible fantasy, but from making essential objectives possible through sheer determination and the unlimited commitment of available resources.